So I'd like to start the Q&A segment by asking each of you, actually, to pose a question to the other that highlights what you consider a central difficulty for the other person's worldview as a public philosophy, as a foundation for these values and ideals that we're saying we agree on and need a foundation. So Professor Haldane, why don't you go first, and then Mr. Hitchens.
Well, where I think we're in agreement is that we're seeking for a kind of tolerant humanism that can respect certain kinds of diversity, not any kind of diversity, but seriously grounded diversity and difference. And I see the foundation of that as provided by respect for individuals as autonomous centers of created life, if you like. And I suppose my question most basically
Excuse me, did you say autonomous centers of created life?
Created life, yeah. Which is also itself part of an ongoing creation, I think. But I suppose my question, very simply, to Christopher would be this. What does he think grounds the values of human dignity, respect, human value, and so on, if not the kind of theological foundation that I suggested?
Well, first I think a fairly unsentimental realism, which would consist at the minimum of a recognition that we're not created, that we are evolved, and that we are in fact identifiable members of a primate species with kinship with other animals. Some people don't like to believe this or think it would be unpleasant if it was true, but it just is. So we may as well deal with that. I am generally tolerant. I love to teach arguments. I like to take part in arguments, but in this case there is no argument about creationism versus evolution. It's over. It's been over since a debate at the Natural History Museum in this university in the mid-19th century. The basis further for our morality, why is it that we think of others? Why do we care for them? I think is equally simple, if you like. Just as religion is preached to the simple and doesn't require a great superstructure of theology, the principles are essentially, I would even say, simplistic, but we have such a thing as human solidarity. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have got this far. The usual statement of the nearest statement we can make of the moral absolute, the best approximation we've come up with is what's called the Golden Rule. It's variously stated, but it's usually rendered as something like, don't do to others what you would not wish them to do to you. This, of course, makes it difficult to pass judgment on people like Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler. It's open to the charge that it's only as good as the person making it. That's why I have a difficulty with the idea of moral absolutes, but it's a pretty good approximation. There's no society ever been discovered that doesn't have some such principle. If you tell me that my grandmother's Jewish ancestors got as far as Sinai not knowing that murder and theft and perjury were bad, and only then found out, I will say to you, they wouldn't have got that far if they'd been under another impression. There has been no revelation of this. It doesn't come from on high. It's innate. It's one of the things that makes up for being a primate. If there are some people who don't have it, but we call them psychopathic. And we have to reason it. If Jesus and Muhammad and Abraham and Moses had never been born, which in any case I tend to doubt, or if all the stories told about them were untrue, if that was suddenly to be found and everyone had to admit it, some people I know would go into a panic. Now what will we do? We have no morals suddenly. What could be more nonsensical than that? As a matter of fact, the position we occupy would be precisely the same as it is now. If none of these texts had ever been written, if none of these supposed utterances had ever been made, we would still have to reason together about how to treat one another, about how to build a just city, and about how to have irony and a sense of humor. So that's my answer. And I think the idea that there's a supernatural dictatorship required for us to think about our duties and responsibilities to each other is the most sinister idea ever invented. These questions cannot be referred up to a celestial dear leader. We do not live and do not wish to live, fortunately in any case don't have to live, in a divine North Korea. Thank you.
Mr. Hitchens, your turn.
Already. I quite deliberately didn't ask myself earlier what I was going to ask, and I'm not even completely sure now, out of a target-rich environment of stuff that I took from your remarks, Professor Haldane. I think what I'd like to ask you is this, and don't think of it as ad hominem, please. Would you really prefer me to be a Wahhabi Muslim or an Orthodox Jew or a Jesuit? Do you think I'd be a better person? Do you wish there were more Orthodox Jews, Wahhabi Muslims, and Jesuits, and fewer people like me? And if there were, do you think the world would be a more moral place? Seriously.
Well, I don't know whether the particular classes were chosen with some.
I could add to the potential
some
classes.
sinister intent.
I could add to the phylae, if you wish.
Yeah. I've no reason to think that simply by matter of some creedal affiliation that people would be any better or worse. And I think in that respect it is important, perhaps I should make this clear in case the point had been missed. It's no part of anything that I've said so far that the content of morality derives from some set of divine commands. I mean, you spoke about the idea...
It's not.
No. You spoke about the idea of some sort of supernatural dictatorship or something of that sort. What I was talking about were the grounds of value, not the idea that these... If you take, for example, you mentioned the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would have them treat you, which is one of the formulations, effectively, of Kant's categorical imperative, another one of which is treat others not merely as means, but always as ends. Now, both of those formulations, the interesting thing is if you ask the question, who are others in this respect, right? This principle has to be applied. When you say treat others, it doesn't include pieces of furniture, right? So the question is, who gets in to the constituency of that? And my suggestion is this, that when one starts to probe the question of who the other is in this respect, what comes forward is an idea of a person, the person, as a kind of site and locus of a certain kind of inviolable value. And my question, not to you, but I mean the question I'm inviting others to discuss is this: what could explain the existence of centers of inviolable value? Now, here's one answer to that. The transference by a creator of a certain kind of value that's attached to that deity itself onto others whom he chooses to extend as part of a certain kind of community of his own. And by the way, the community of his own here is not in the sense of a covenanted community or some set of peoples against another set of people. This is all people. So nothing of what I had to say was to do with the idea that morality comes in the form of divine commands, but that rather the condition or the possibility of morality is that there be special kinds of beings in the world that nature itself doesn't account for.
Good. All right, well, I have my own questions for you. First, from Mr. Hitchens. How can your perspective, part of what we're talking about tonight is providing common ground for our public deliberations, and how can your perspective, especially...
Yeah, let's not overdo that.
Right. That's right. Let's be tasteful, yeah. How can your perspective provide that kind of common ground if it dismisses a large majority of the population as irrational, as stuck in what you call, in your book, the infancy of our race? I mean, doesn't that remove any room or incentive for people to try to reason together?
Not at all. I mean, religion is a private matter, in my opinion. I phrase it like this in my book. I just say, if you think that there's a creator who's made you specially, and who watches over you and supervises you, who cares about you and wants you to do well, and even wants you to survive death, I have to say, I think it's a preposterous proposition, because I have to be honest, and an irrational one, and a fatuous one, and a sinister one, because the idea of wanting a father who never dies and won't quit is infantilizing. But suppose you did think that, shouldn't it make you happy? It doesn't make them happy. Doesn't make them better at all. They won't be happy till I believe it too. So the first principle is, separate that. Keep it to yourselves. Go to any church you like. Build any church you want. Do it with your own money. Don't ask the government to teach this stuff to my children in a government school. We won't have that. And surely, in other words, I don't, when I'm offended by a filthy article I read about atheists and Jews and secularists, I have to, bombardments of stuff of this kind comes at me all the time. I don't go out and burn down the nearest mosque because I've been offended, do I? Don't be ridiculous. But I'm supposed to respect those who do such things. I'm supposed to treat them with an extra delicacy. Why should I be doing that? Who's the offended one here, really? I'm not going to make a big point about my feelings being hurt. I have a thick skin, I have a broad back, I've studied Socrates, I think the Socratic method is more convincing. But you act as if I'm the one who's offending them by saying, I find your beliefs actually rather unconvincing. And in any case, I'm not going to have them forced on me. Now, is that finally clear? Is it? I hope so. Good.
Well, Professor Haldane, someone might have a similar worry in terms of fairness about your own views. So you think that a lot of the moral norms and principles that we base even some of our policies on, so inviolability of the innocent and so on, are dependent on theological claims. But if we base political decisions on Christian ideas at all, isn't it unfair to impose those decisions on non-Christians who can't accept their rationale? I mean, especially if there are non-theological arguments to make the same points.
Well, look, I mean, what I'm suggesting is this is a kind of two-stage process here. First of all, what I think is extremely important, and this I agree ought to be a matter of common agreement, at least if not universal agreement, wide agreement between us, is that it is very important to fashion some basis, to identify some basis of common shared values beyond the merely procedural values that I made reference to. Because matters of mere procedural fairness are not going to get us through to the deeper questions. So then the question is, on what basis does one do that? Now, I think that, and here actually, again, I think there should be an area of agreement. I think that, for example, the thinkers of the Enlightenment who emphasized the importance of autonomy, of self-direction, of lives lived from the inside, if I can put it that way, rather than order imposed from the outside, I think identified something very important. But I think we need to probe that question further. What is it to live such a life? It's not just to choose randomly, it's to choose in accord with a conception of value and so on. So what I see at the heart of I see two things at the heart of human nature. One is a striving, a reaching out for truth, a reaching out for goodness and so on, which we recognize in one another, and this enables us to identify one another as members of the same moral species, if I could put it that way. But I think we also find in ourselves, and we find in one another, a kind of conflictedness that expresses itself universally, quite independently of culturally variant circumstances and so on. So what we're looking for now at this deeper level is an explanation of how it could be that we're beings of a sort that find ourselves directed towards the good and the true, but also beings of a sort that find ourselves apparently irresolvably conflicted both in our interior and between ourselves. Now, I think at that point, the story has to continue. You can't just stop at that point. And I think a religious foundation here of the sort that I've just sort of suggested doesn't turn at this point on the tenets of particular revelations. If you like, in that respect, it's a natural theological foundation. But the question then would be, to what extent is that picked up in particular faiths and traditions? And I think, by the way, that in this respect, there is a moral criterion of the adequacy of particular revelations and faiths, the extent to which they do or fail to conform with those ideals and values. So I don't think that every faith is to be respected. That's why, I'm not interested in a kind of sentimental universalism that accommodates faith as if it were some sort of trump card in every context. There are some faiths that are absolutely, abhorrent. There are some scriptures that are abhorrent, and one has to apply a test of reasonableness. But I think at the end of the day, the foundation of that reasonability rests beyond a confined natural human nature and points in the direction of a kind of supernatural order. That's the view.
Got it.
You say got it?
Just registering what he said.